we'll just open it out to the class, whoever is able to join us today. And if you want, we can play a little bit of the Tsar audio documentary if you have a clip that you think might be good. So I just would ask you to kind of, in a general sense, introduce yourself. I know Mariam knows you, so that's a bit weird to talk to a group, but I think everyone else doesn't. So if you can just introduce yourself a bit, tell us a bit about your background, that'd be great.
Sure. My name is Zeina. أنا مصرية. I'm Egyptian, but I moved to London quite a few years ago now. And I did my undergrad here in philosophy, politics, and economics. And then I did a master's right after in development studies. And then I realized I really don't like academia in general, or like, not that I don't like it, but that it didn't really fit with how I like to tell stories. So I started to look at different ways I can tell stories that people actually want to hear, and that stories that are actually accessible. And so I reached out to Kerning Cultures because I listened to their podcasts, and I asked if I could work with them. And I've been working there now for over a year and a half. So I started in February 2019. So it's been quite a while. I started as an intern, and then after a couple of months, I got hired properly. And it's a really cool team. Kerning Cultures is a Middle East podcast network. We have 6 shows in English and in Arabic. And they cover a range of topics and a range of regions. And the team we're 12 now, and we're kind of spread out all over. And we work remotely to do interviews, to write together, to edit together. Our trying to find timings for our calls is always like the worst part of the week. But we managed to make it work. And yeah, that's about it. Other than the podcast, I have like a day job, I guess I should call it. I work at a think tank, and I have my laptop up here because I get emails. But yeah, that's about it. That's me.
So you have 2 jobs, basically. You're double jobbing, is what you're saying.
Yeah.
So
don't recommend it.
Yeah, I don't recommend it. Yeah. I mean, one thing I think maybe is interesting for some of the students to think about is, what you start out studying, what you initially begin your university life with, but then how that can take twists and turns. And I mean, when I talked to you, I think maybe you should tell people you actually interviewed me last week or the
Yes,
week
so
before,
this is
something
quite
like
a
that.
switch around.
Yeah.
But I interviewed Ronnie for an episode last week, I think.
Yeah.
So it's really funny to be on this side of the questions and answers. But yeah, it was definitely like a big shift to work in podcasting, I think, because I really had my mind set on working in politics or in that realm of politics. And then for a while I was like, great, I'm going to do a PhD. I'm going to be a professor. It's going to be awesome. And then I just realized that I didn't like how any research I was doing was only going to be read by a very, very small portion of the people it could be reaching. And that there are more interesting and exciting ways to be able to tell stories about different research that you like to do. And there are definitely topics that just completely fascinate me, and that I end up going into these weird rabbit holes in. And I love being able to sort of produce those as episodes. So you get to interview all of these really interesting people. You get to figure out how you're going to put a story together in 30 minutes that's interesting and exciting, but also tells you like a proper story that's informative. And it really changed the way I kind of see where my career is going, because it's shown me different ways I can kind of reach people and tell stories. So that's been really exciting.
So what would you say studying actually did for you? I mean, because obviously you didn't actually study how to do audio productions or how to study narratives, I think. No, would that be true? I mean,
no, I didn't.
Yeah.
I learned all of that like on the job. What studying taught me was how to do research. I think that was like the one big thing I got out of it. And actually, when I first got hired at Kerning Cultures, it was as a researcher, because it taught me how to do like extensive, comprehensive research in a way where you can really look into the different aspects of a topic. So for instance, if I'm looking at one of the episodes I worked on was on a Palestinian film unit, which is guerrilla film unit in Palestine that started in 1968. And they wanted to sort of film Palestine from a perspective of Palestinians, because at the time it was only outsiders that were filming Palestine, and it was very colonial. And so you really need to be able to do research to start finding the articles, the books that have been written about it, to start finding the people who were actually part of the film unit and find their contact details and figure out to reach out. I say that most of this job is learning how to be a stalker, because it really is about finding people's contact details and finding things about people online so that you can really prepare for interviews and so on. But almost everything about producing and storytelling I learned on the job. The only thing I think that I really properly got from university was a really good research background, so that I knew that whatever the story is, I'd be able to figure out the context and the history of it.
Okay, good. Yeah, because I mean, you actually found me, right? We don't know each other at all. I guess you just Googled the project you're working on at the moment, and somehow that led to something I'd written.
Yeah. So I don't know if Ronnie has told you guys, but so I'm doing a story on a street in Iran called Bobby Sands Street. And Bobby Sands was an IRA revolutionary who died in a hunger strike in Ireland in 81. And a couple of teenagers in Iran apparently were so swept up with this idea of this guy killing himself for his ideology and really believing in that message, they changed the name of the street in front of the British Embassy from Winston Churchill Street to Bobby Sands Street. And I thought that was so interesting, how street names can change and what street names really mean and the symbols behind it. And so I'm doing an episode on street names around the Middle East. And I found Ronnie because he wrote his PhD on it, actually. And that's how we connected.
Yeah. So it was just a Google search, right? Probably.
Yeah, it was literally just a Google search.
Yeah. Because I think this is one thing when you interviewed me, we also did talk a little bit about other subjects. And that was one thing we talked about, is actually trying to produce things in the current situation where you physically can't meet people, which is obviously restrictive on one level. But then on another level, if you are actually quite good at researching and you reach out to people, you're the kind of, really, there's a huge network of availability there for people you can work with.
Definitely. It's, on the one hand, it's been really restrictive to be, in COVID, and I can't do interviews in person, and I can't be, sending even tape syncers to record my interviews. But on the other hand, it's really opened up who we can contact and how many people we can interview, because it's really kind of expanded what we thought was possible in terms of like how to get a good story. And so that's everything from, for instance, like the British Library, because I'm here in London. The British Library was a really big resource that a lot of us used. I mean, me and Alex, another person who's in the UK. But now that it's closed, we've had to really rely on online archives. And that means that we get access to archives that we wouldn't usually be able to go see. And so that's really changed. And then on the other hand, also in terms of interviews, there, for those of you who are interested, there's this course, I think it's still open. It's like a night center course for journalism called Digital Investigation, which is really, like, genuinely, if I say I learned how to stalk, this is how to do it. Like, it's a course on basically how to do social network analysis. So it teaches you everything from how to find the character, how to verify them, how to make a story, for instance, from people's Twitter feeds. So like how to start looking over several different users to like pull together a story or connect a thread, and how to do that over different social media networks as well. So these are things that usually I would never think about looking at or think about using, but now that I don't really leave this house at all, it's really sort of changed the way I start to think about stories and investigating them. And so you start to research all of these different methods and tools that you could be using.
Yeah, that's really good tips, I think, and ideas, and also a kind of perspective, because we don't know what's going to happen, in the future, and it might be a kind of a new kind of work dynamic that we're actually entering into. So I wonder, could you tell us a little bit how you progressed from your studies, which, like you say, were very academic, I presume you wrote like a thesis, and did you have exams and things like that as well, or?
Yeah, my master's was very heavy. It was very intense. Um, and it was a lot of research and a lot of writing. And I think that's what really turned me off from it in general. Um, but in terms of progression, I think one of the biggest things was learning how to write differently. Because I'd been so tuned into writing essays or writing papers or my thesis, for instance, and it's a very specific style of writing. And so learning, almost unlearning that and starting to learn different styles of writing. So for instance, writing a script or writing an article, or even we do these weekly kernels of culture on our Instagram page, which is our mini stories that we do on our Instagram stories. And writing for that is a very specific type of writing as well, because it's short, it's catchy. You want it to be able to go for, 10 slides or so on and be able to tell a story. So I think learning how to write differently and how to tell stories, even if it's the same story, but telling it in different ways. I think that was something that I really learned after graduating. And then things like how to conduct an interview. Like I really didn't know how to conduct an interview in the beginning. Like I know how to ask people questions, but I think there's like a very specific style to doing a good interview and being able to get the right tape out of the person you're interviewing, because the worst thing in the world is spending an hour, and I've done this before many times, spending an hour interviewing someone and then coming out of it and realizing that most of their answers were either like, yes, that's true, or no, that's not true. And you can't really use that in a podcast because you want them to be speaking, not you to be speaking. And so it's learning how to, for instance, do a good interview so that you're getting the right sort of quotes or the right sort of tape, depending on what you're doing from your interviewee. That was something I learned as well. And then also just how to, reach out to people and ask for favors or ask for help, or how to get people to agree to an interview in the first place, and make sure that, you can have that sort of conversation and start building those relationships with other journalists or with academics or experts that, you can rely on later on for different projects. And so all of that, I think, is stuff that you learn on the go. It's the kind of thing that you have to learn as you're doing it, because it really is practice, and it really is just getting the hang of it. And I think that's stuff that I learned in my transition from academia to work.
Yeah, brilliant. I wonder, what sort of advice would you have for students looking to get into the area of storytelling?
I think my biggest advice is reach out to the people you want to work with and ask them if you can work with them. No one is ever going to say no to an extra pair of hands. And at least for me, the thing I learned was that you really need to be learning on the job. And so reach out to all of your favorite podcasters, your favorite journalists, your favorite writers, whoever it may be, depending on what kind of story you want to write, and ask them, if you can learn from them, and if you can shadow them or intern with them, depending on what it is, what role it is. And then also try it out yourself. Like, even if you don't have all of the equipment, even till now, I still don't have like big proper journalist equipment, but trying it out yourself with your iPhone microphone, which is better than anyone would expect, really gets you in the habit of learning what works and what doesn't. And reach out to people and do your own articles, even if it's for no one, and write your own podcast, even if it's for no one. But just getting into the habit of going through the process and going through the motions, I think really helps pull it all together.
Okay, and what sort of tips would you have, that makes a really good story or podcast project? What are the kind of really, special features that make something, really work?
I think, for instance, the one thing that I learned that you didn't need in academia, but you really need in a story, is a good conflict or a good point of tension or a good turning point. Because I've tried doing stories without it, and we end up cutting them, right before they're supposed to be published, because there's nothing pulling the audience in and wanting them to listen more. Because asking someone for either 10 minutes of their time to read an article or 30 minutes of their time to listen to your episode, that's time that they're dedicating listening to something that you're doing. So you want to make sure that you're doing it in a way that really pulls them in. So having a really, really strong hook in the beginning, and then some sort of conflict or tension that you're leading up to that then gets resolved, or maybe not, by the end of the episode. I think that really makes a difference, because then you want to keep listening and you want to keep learning more. And something else that I found really helps and really kind of connects people to the episodes or articles that you're writing is if your story sort of has like a larger meaning or a larger message or a larger story behind it. And some of the podcasts that we get the most kind of traction to are things that, you know, have one sort of story, like tell a story about a person, for instance. Like we had one about Zabel, who's this Armenian singer, and people, like, it's her story and her life and what happened and, you know, all of that. But at the same time, it was a really big story about the Armenian genocide and the diaspora that immigrated to America and so on. So you had two sort of messages that you were leaving with, and that keeps you thinking about what you've just listened to or what you've just read. And makes you want to share it with your friends, because if it's something you're going to keep thinking about, it's definitely something you're going to want to keep sharing.
Turn myself on. So yeah, I mean, just actually leading into, you know, one of the projects you worked on is the Tsar project in Cairo, that I'm sure everyone in Egypt is vaguely familiar with what Tsar is. So I'm just wondering, what would you kind of describe as the kind of unique feature of that particular story?
So there's a couple, but I'm assuming all of you know, Zor is like it used to be a very traditional practice in Egypt about calling spirits through music and dance, and then over the course of decades, through movies and songs and TV shows and so on, it became really heavily stigmatized, and people made fun of it and didn't take it seriously. And now it's kind of dying out. You can only really see performances of it for مثلا Mastaba or Makan, like those kinds of cultural centers, but it's hard to go find a real Zar. So I guess the interesting point about that one was the process of finding the Zar became part of the episode, because it was so difficult to find one. Like we really there are two other producers, Aishin from Masr, their names are Nadine and Hiba, and the three of us really like did a lot of searching to try and find the real Zar, and we had to go through a lot of different contacts. And, you know, at some point people were asking us to pay them, and ethically we don't pay people for, you know, recordings and so on, because it doesn't really follow journalistic practices. But we couldn't find a way to get to one, and it ended up being like 3 months before we were able to find one and actually attend one. And so I think that struggle to find it became part of the story, and that was something that doesn't usually make it into the story. Like you usually just hear the story and not the process of finding it. But because it was such a long and tough kind of road to get to, and it really became part of the story. And something else I think that makes that episode really unique is the sound design. It's very, very rich in its sound design, because it's about the musical practice. So you want there to be music, and you want there to be a lot of sound, and you want people to be able to listen like alongside as you're describing it, because it makes no sense to describe something and not have either a visual or audio reference for people to be able to see what you're describing or hear what you're describing. And that's something that that we took a lot of sort of care to make sure happens in the episode.
Yeah, I mean, I did share it with everyone, and I hope they listened, or they had a chance to listen to some of it, but I'm sure they will catch up on it if they didn't. And it is a really great documentary, I think. And, you know, like you say, it's a very rich sound design. And that's at the beginning of this course, we actually did an audio project, and we worked with that idea of using layered sound to kind of, you know, to add to the narrative. Not to illustrate it, but, you know, to kind of give a sense of atmosphere or feeling. So it's great to see a brilliant example of that produced in Egypt. But there's something you said that's quite interesting, and this is something that I've come across in my now 8 years teaching in the AUC, is a kind of, and it's something I think affects many areas of kind of research or journalism, is the sort of difficulty of penetrating Egyptian culture. You know, that, like you say, people were asking for money. I mean, this is one of the most common things. And I just wonder, you know, how do you get around those kinds of obstacles? One is, you know, sometimes people want to be paid for something, which, like you say, is ethically wrong in terms of journalism. So that's one issue. But then also that people can be quite evasive or secretive, you know, about opening up a bit and sharing something. So, you know, how did you get around those obstacles? Because you spent a long time in Cairo working on this, right? Coming back and forth.
Yeah, it was a bit difficult. I think in terms of the money, like for instance, we found out that the New York Times pays all of their contacts when they're in Egypt and they need interviews, right? And so I know, shock and horror. But you know, it turns out that some people see that if paying money is the way to go, then that's what we should do. And so it was really like a big conversation that we had as a team, as in, you know, do we want to stick to our guts or do we want to just do what helps us out the most? But what really ended up making a difference was sort of patience, and it was a lot of patience. And we found the sheikha who held zars, who, you know, was open to speaking to us, but she was not open to us attending it, and especially not attending it with microphones, which, you know, seemed like a big violation of what she wanted to do. And it took a lot of patience. We spoke to her for, I think, like a month and a half before we actually went to one with her. And it was really long conversations about what we want to do. And because it was a practice that's been so stigmatized and that has seen such a big pushback recently, she just wanted to make sure that we were painting it in a way that wasn't, you know, negative, or painting it in a way that wasn't vilifying it any more than it already is. And so what I found is it was just a lot of patience, and it was a lot of time, and it was putting the effort in to make those connections and putting the effort in to build that trust. And in the end, we did attend, and we didn't pay her, but we paid like women who attend the ZAR generally pay like a participation fee. And so we paid that as well, as sort of like a sign of respect, and also just to follow the custom of it. But we thought that that was sort of the best way to move forward. And it ended up being like a really good experience. And she's still someone that, you know, if we ever do decide to do a story about it again, I'm sure we'd be able to contact her and bring that back. So it really is about building trust and taking time. I mean, our stories take around like 6 months per story. So it does take a lot longer than people expect from when we first come up with a story to when it's published. And a big part of that is finding the right people to interview, finding the right people to reach out to, and putting the story together. And many times, for instance, for people who listen to the episode, I mean, no pressure, but Hagar, the academic that I interviewed in the episode, that was a very, very last minute addition. We added her almost a week before the episode was going to be released. And so there was a lot of rewriting around her. So it does take a lot of time to make sure you've got the right people. And part of that is, you know, allowing yourself time to get it wrong. And that script went through 4 different versions before it is where it is today. And so you need to give yourself time to get it wrong and to be patient and just, you know, wait for it to come together and put the effort in, I think.
Yeah, that's a really interesting insight on it. When people do listen to it, I think you'll hopefully get something from those kind of the background to it and the amount of effort that goes into producing something like that. And it's very interesting what you say about the New York Times. So I'm just wondering a little bit about Kerning Cultures in general as an organization. I mean, like, how do you actually, you know, how do you differentiate yourselves, or do you differentiate yourselves from other journalism or other podcast entities, you know, given that you have this Middle East specialism and you also work bilingual, right? You work Arabic and English completely. So I guess my question is, you know, how do you distinguish yourselves as a kind of brand identity, if you like? And then also, you know, how do you actually, how is something like this sustained? How is it a viable, you know, thing?
Good question. So I can answer the second one first. Where it's like a venture funded podcasts. So we do have investors in the podcast network, or we had like a Series A or a seed funding series, and we're now raising for Series A. So it's an investor heavy podcast, but right now our income stream is mostly, so for instance, Patreon, where people can support us on a monthly basis. Advertisements, we run ads in the beginning and middle of our episodes sometimes. And then also what we call like white label production. So for instance, let's say Nestle in Egypt wants to do, or Nivea, for instance, Nivea wants to do a 6-episode series on skincare because they think it's going to be good for their brand. We'll do all the production work for them. And then they can have the series as like Nivea's podcast, and like it's their thing. But then we do actually all the behind the scenes. So white label productions are probably our biggest source of income. And then in terms of how we identify ourselves, a big part of it is saying, that we're a podcast network that's from the region, and it's human-led stories from the Middle East, and stories that you want to gather around with your friends with a cup of tea or a cup of coffee and listen to them. Not that we stay away from politics, because many of our stories end up being quite political, but our stories first and foremost are about people, and they're the people that we want to showcase in our interviews, in our episodes, if it's about someone in particular. And it's in a way that is supposed to really be able to tell that story in a very sort of audio rich but very culturally rich way. But there are other podcast networks in the Middle East. Sot, for instance, in Jordan is very, very big. And Fasla, I think, actually is in Egypt, and they're starting out as well. And so there are definitely more and more podcasts sort of penetrating the Middle East podcast scene from Arabs and from people in the region. And so it's not just all outsiders. And I think that's great, because I think the more stories that are being told, the better. And it's going to be different perspectives. It's going to be different topics, different, sides. And I think that's something that really should be celebrated. And yeah, we like to work with them as much as we can.
Yeah, that's great. I mean, just to let you know, in case you may not have heard of it, there was actually a podcast conference festival in the AUC last March, which is supposed to be, it was just before Corona. It was literally the weekend before Corona, I think. And it's supposed to happen again next spring. And it's a colleague of mine in the AUC who's one of the organizers, Kim Fox. But it was really amazing. I mean, the kind of amount of people that were interested in podcasting in Egypt was actually, I think, really, it wasn't just that actually it was actually really well attended. There were a number of workshops and things, so it wasn't a kind of academic conference, in the straight sense. But it was also the kind of buzz, like people were actually really excited. It was a really genuine thing. It was probably the best thing I've been at in Egypt. So in a way, maybe podcasting is something that is actually starting to take traction in the Middle East in general.
Definitely. And there's a big business case for it. I mean, there's a lot of money, and people argue whether or not it's a bubble, but there is a lot of money being invested in podcasting right now, because it's a region that, especially older generations, very heavily listen to the radio. And so it's just basically the radio, but it's pre-recorded and you can listen at any time and you don't have to tune in at a specific time. And so there is already such a big radio culture in the region. Switching to podcast seems like a natural transition. And so from a business case, there are many companies that are looking, and foundations and institutes that are looking to start opening podcasts in the region, because you can access a group of the society or population that you wouldn't usually be able to access. And also podcasting kind of goes across the region. So for instance, if you have someone speaking in standard Arabic and Fusha, or even in a cleaner Arabic dialect, you can be listening to it from anywhere in the region, and people will be able to listen and to follow along. And it means that you're not just looking at an Egyptian audience, but you're looking at an entire region's audience. And the diaspora, oh my god, there are so many people in the diaspora who are really keen to listen to stories from back home. And so even just from a business case, there's like a lot of money being invested in it right now.
Yeah, okay. Anyway, I think that's enough for me. I think I've probably bored everyone to death with my questions. So I'm just wondering if there's anybody in the class who's here today. I think 16 people are here today. Or anyway, if they have any questions, if anyone would like to ask a question, just unmute yourself and go ahead. Zeina's there waiting.
I have a question. How do you decide which stories you want to tell? Like which stories are worth telling and which stories you want to decide to shoot, and what's the I don't know how to say, secret ingredient in the story that makes you think it's worth telling?
So for instance, for a podcast, there's a couple things that I think about when I'm thinking about the story. Are there people I can interview for the story? Because sometimes I find historical stories and I think they're sick, but if I'm only going to be interviewing like academics, it can end up being, no offense, Roddy, it can be quite a boring podcast if all you're doing is listening to professors speak about something they've been researching. And so you really want to make sure it's a story where you can get someone, either, even if it's like the grandson of the person you're speaking about, or a different family member. It's really important to have a sort of first person perspective in a podcast. Otherwise, you really start to get lost. Another thing is you need to have at least one person who's a strong speaker, because a lot of people aren't comfortable speaking for long periods of time about their research or about their life. And if they're not strong speakers, people aren't going to want to listen to it. So you want to have at least one person who will be your like lead character, who the story will follow, and then all of the other pieces kind of get stuck in, or you can start putting them together. But if you don't have a lead character, then it can start to get a bit boring, especially if it's going to be a longer podcast. And then another thing is, is this the kind of story that's actually going to benefit from being an audio? So you really have to think about the kind of form that your story is in, because if it's a story that could literally just be a blog article, then maybe it's better as a blog article. But if it's going to be a story that's going to really benefit from having those interviews and being able to listen to these stories, or if there's music that you can involve, is it going to benefit from the form that you're putting it in? That makes a big difference, because sometimes there are stories that I think are really interesting, but I know they wouldn't work for a podcast because they could easily just be an article and you wouldn't lose anything by not listening to it, either because there aren't enough interviews to do, or there's no reason to really put it in audio format. You're not really going to gain anything from it. So it is definitely something we think about when we try to decide what stories work and what don't.
I have a question. Weren't you scared to go and talk about Tsars? Because I mean, like we all know that the anything that has to do with Gin or black magic, even just saying those words terrifies me. I can't imagine like going through a whole research about that. I would be scared to talk to the people or interview them. I don't know. It's very dark. Like specifically, maybe this topic. Maybe there are others that aren't like that. But for this one, oh my god! Like, how did it go?
Mostly, I was very scared. Like, I can't lie and say I was like totally cool with it. Especially, for instance, like my grandma was not happy. Like, it was, there was like a lot of people asking, like, are you sure you want to be looking into this? This isn't the kind of stuff you should be doing stories about. So I think there was definitely some element of fear. But the more I read about it, the more I felt like I'd be able to tell the story in a way that it isn't usually told today. And I thought that that was worth doing the story for, because like all of the only way I had learned about the Tsar was aflam, like movies that just showed it in a very, very dark way or in a very twisted way, or just from people saying like, حاجات بتخوف, like people that were just scaring me from it. And so the more I did research about the actual kind of process and the tradition and the history behind it, I felt like it was worth it. And then when we started interviewing people, just hearing how people were so connected to it and really felt a connection to the Zor, and in a way that wasn't like, intimidating. Like I really felt intimidated, and sometimes I do interviews and I'm like intimidated by the people I'm speaking to, but it was in a way where they really felt a personal connection to it, and I realized like it meant a lot to some people, and it really does feel like they healed them. Like we interviewed women who were like, I couldn't walk, and then I went to a Zara and then I could walk, and you could tell that a lot of people really felt like this personal deep connection to something, and they thought it was a very healing process. And that in the end, for a lot of people, it's actually about like regrowth and regeneration and healing and being better. And it wasn't this like exorcism that we had learned about. So I think it was worth it in the end. But yeah, definitely I was scared. And thankfully, like I have a team with me. So like if, for instance, a lot of the interviews, it was 2 of us that went to go do it instead of just 1 person. And sometimes that happens when it's a story that is a bit bigger than we would expect it to be. But yeah, like I definitely was scared. Like I wasn't just like, cool about it.
Okay, any more questions? Anybody want to jump in there?
Yeah, Professor, I have a question. I wanted to ask you, Zeina, about the natural sounds. Like in the Zara project, you used the recordings of the songs that were sung. I just wanted to ask technically which equipment did you use to get this quality, as it's really hard for us to produce sounds with this quality, and the portion of the podcast, how much the amount of natural sounds you use in a normal podcast.
So for this one, the equipment we were using a Zoom H6, and it had a shotgun mic attached to it at the actual Zar. That was the equipment we were using. But for most of our interviews, it was actually like a Zoom H1N, which I don't have right now. It's been sent to someone for an interview. But it's this tiny little recorder, and I put like a foam cover just for for plosives and so on. So most of our interviews do end up being on quite small, handy recorders because they're very portable, and we end up getting good audio from them. In terms of the proportion, and then also, yeah, in terms of natural sounds, like for instance, all of our interviews are done in quiet places, other than the interviews that took place at the Zor itself. All of the other interviews were done in like closed rooms with as much soundproofing as possible, to make sure that we get good audio that we could then overlay, other sounds on top of. And the interviews at the Zor, we would take them almost into a separate room, so the background sound is kind of calm a bit before we start interviewing them, because a lot of the tape actually from the Zor, we had like 3.5 hours of tape, and we ended up using less than 10 minutes of it maybe in the episode, because a lot of it was really bad and a lot of it was super like unusable. You really do your best when you're shooting kind of in scene, or like in the scene or in the environment, to try and get the best sounds you can. And then in terms of our sound design, a lot of our sound design does come from, or a lot of the sounds, especially our background music, does come from like certain websites that we pay for to be able to get audio from. But a lot of it is also stuff that is either under like a Creative Commons license so that we can use it, or sounds that we have 2 sound designers or 1 sound designer, and all of us know how to like sound design our episodes, and then he mixes everything in the end. But a lot of it is like not natural sound. So a lot of it isn't sound that we actually record. Much of it does tend to be from either like audio banks or so on. But for episodes that are music related, like the Zara episode, we try as much as we can for it to be natural sound. And so for instance, we recorded a performance in Mastaba and a performance in Makan and at the actual Zara, and like all of that different sounds ended up being in the final episode.
Okay, great. Thank you, Zeina. Anybody else got a question for Zeina?
One last thing. Would you do like a podcast about something very controversial in Egypt, like the circumcision, for girls, because I know that right now people, especially after the whole the scandals of sexual harassment and all these things, everyone is I don't want to say questioning, but everyone is starting to slowly but surely think about female sexuality in the Arab world. And I know that it's also going, like, it's also something relevant now abroad. So what do you think about that?
We've done them before. Like, we have an Arabic show, Ismo Jasadi, and it is basically episodes about like the mind and the body and health and everything in between. And we've had episodes that could be seen as like controversial or taboo subjects, whether it be like, for instance, like a couple and they're going through sexual issues and they don't know how to conceive, for instance, or like when we do controversial episodes, I think the biggest thing is just making sure it's not like an episode about the government. So that's basically like our criteria, is like, you can talk about it from like a human perspective. You can talk about it like someone who goes, I'm feeling this way and I'm going through this thing and this thing is affecting me this way. And, you know, this is how my life has changed because of it. But we try, just because A, our personal safeties, and B, like, we don't need that kind of trouble, we try to avoid it being like a policy thing or about a government thing or being critical of laws and so on. So we can talk about them, but we try as best as we can not to be critical. Also, for instance, like, we have 2 producers for Saudia, and we do tend to do a lot of episodes with Nism Saudia, but again, it's making sure that you're not doing it in a way that's really critical of the kingdom and so on, because it does put them into trouble. And we do have to think about everyone on the team, and everyone lives in different countries and they have different sort of laws that govern what they can and can't say. And so we do have to be really considerate of everyone on the team, because you don't want to be like, yes, I want to do the story, and then in the end it fucks someone over, you know. Sorry, I don't know if I'm supposed to swear, Ronnie. But yeah, like, for instance, we had an LGBT story that we really wanted to do, and it was something that ended up being really, no, it was actually in Lebanon, but it was like going to be a more regional thing. And it ended up being a very, very long discussion on the team, because, for instance, like, 3 of our producers felt like it could put them at personal risk to be credited on an episode that was about LGBT, you know, in their countries. And like, no one wants to, you know, like, our team is more important than the story we want to do. But there definitely like is a trade-off, and we do think about it a lot when we're like doing our stories. But the key is to make it about the person and not about whatever it is that's like affecting them. So for instance, if we are to do an episode about the Salt Police, it would be about Nadine and about her story and about, you know, the change it's done, and stories with, you know, people who want to be, you know, interviewed about their experiences and so on. But it wouldn't be about like what the government is doing and how they're reacting and so on, because then that could put people into trouble.
Nadine threatened, by the way, like,
I know. I know.
Like, target too many.
I know. But it's just about trying to be really, really careful, especially you don't want to get anyone into trouble. Either the people you're interviewing or yourself.
That's true. Thank you, Zeina.
Of course.
Yeah, just maybe one sort of concluding question I might have is just if you could, because I'm very curious about this, about your organization, like your Kerning Cultures, like you're all in different countries. You know, how do you actually work together? I mean, this is a very interesting model of doing stuff, right? That you're this kind of network.
Yeah, so there is 2 people in Cairo. There's 1 person in Riyadh and 1 person in Jeddah. There's 2 people in Dubai, 1 person in Beirut, 1 person in Amman, and then me and another producer who are in London, and then 2 other people who are in the States. So we're like kind of spread out, mostly in the region, but like kind of spread out. And our interns are in the States as well, both of them right now, actually. So it means that meetings are like a real struggle to get to, and it means that you're going to be getting messages at like any time of day, because when I wake up in the morning, I've gotten messages from people in the region, and then what after I finish work, I'm still getting messages from people in the States. So it really blurs any like work-life boundaries you want to have, because you are like getting messages at all times. But what works for us is having sort of like a weekly standing call that isn't going to change and works for everyone's, even though it's quite early for some people or quite late for others, and ends up working for everyone. And then we work on things like Slack, for instance, on Google Drive, on Dropbox, to be able to pick up work wherever it is and not, need the other person to be online for you to be able to work. And it works for us by having clear deadlines. So for instance, if I know that I have like a live read of the script, which is when I'm supposed to have cut all my audio, like gotten my script together, and it's like the first time that the other producers get to hear it, I know that that's the deadline, and everyone knows that they have to do their piece of the work by that deadline. So it doesn't really matter when you get it done. The important thing is that you get it done by the deadline. So I think that works for us because it allows for our flexibility. Also, not everyone works full time. Like I work part time, other producers work part time, and then some people work part time as in like 10 hours a week, or some people work part time as in like only Monday and Tuesday a week. So our schedules really are super different. And so it's making sure we can stay connected on WhatsApp, on Slack, and then also making sure our work stays connected on things like Google Drive or Dropbox, so that you can always check in on where everyone else is and where you need to work without having to make sure the other person is online or active.
Okay, thank you, Zeina. So are there any final questions? Maybe we'll let you go because we did agree to like half an hour or so. But is there anyone else wants to jump in with a question before we say adieu and bye-bye and thank you?
Thank you. Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you, Zeina.
Okay, Zeina, thank you very much. It's been really
Thank you,
kind of
Ronnie.
you.
Thank you, everyone.
I meant to say that actually the connections, as you probably realize, are really bad, and the internet connections
Don't
are really
worry,
bad.
I've done it before. It's
Yeah.
no problem.
So we don't get a lot of face-to-face Zoom communication.
No, I understand.
But listen, I want to ask you one final question, just a little one. I mean, so just in terms of Tsar, going back to that, I mean, have you been in touch with your Tsar, or has the Tsar come into your life in a bigger way since making the program?
Well, like yes and no. It's definitely on my mind a lot more, and it's definitely something that like outside of a story I would be interested in like trying or going to. But like we do a lot of stories that really impact us, and I've done a lot of stories that really stick with me, and interviewed people that are still on my Facebook and like that kind of thing. And so you do end up getting really connected to the people you're interviewing, especially because we do it over such a long time. And for a lot of people, it's usually very like personal testimony and stuff that they're really sharing about their lives. So there is like a sort of distance that I end up getting from everything, because if I start thinking about everything too much, it gets a bit overwhelming. And so like the stories stick with you, but you just have to make sure they don't like get to you, because then like you can't keep working because you're thinking too much about things that have already happened. So yeah, so like yes, it's definitely stuck with me, and I'm definitely more open to the practice. And now when I speak about it with people, it's usually in a much more like positive and constructive light than it would have been before the story. But it hasn't like super affected the way I'm like interacting with it.
You did. Thank you very much, Zeina. That's been amazing.
Thank you,
For your
everyone.
time. I must say, I really enjoyed being interviewed by you, and I think
Thank you.
I've looked at the website and listened to some of the documentaries. I think they're really excellent. So I encourage
Thank you.
everyone to do the same. Check out the Tsar one, maybe start with that. Take a subscription or make a contribution. These things are very important to, information.
And I'll send everyone
ideas.
Ronnie's episode when it's out, so you can hear Ronnie
Well,
in the episode.
okay, I look forward to that. Okay, thank you, Zeina, and
Perfect.
have a good day.
Thank you
over
so
there
much.
in London.
Thank
Okay.
you. Bye, everyone.
Bye.
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 Okay, I'm on.